Welcome to the Teaching Literacy Podcast. I am your host, Jake Downs. I'm a 4th grade teacher, PhD student at Utah State University, and someone who just wants to know more about reading. This podcast is about bridging literacy research and practice. Every episode, you'll hear from a literacy researcher about their work, why it matters, and how to turn it into practice in your classroom. Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of the Teaching Literacy Podcast. I'm super excited this week to continue our conversation with Dr. Chase Young. Dr. Young's an associate professor of literacy at Sam Houston State University, and he recently co-authored a book with Timothy Rasinski that's titled Tiered Fluency Instruction, Supporting Diverse Learners in Grades 2 through 5. It's a fantastic book. I really enjoyed reading it because it provides a whole ton of reading fluency ideas, and then it looks at it through the RTI framework. So there's Tier 1 ideas in there, Tier 2, and then Tier 3. And as you move throughout the tiers, the instruction gets a little bit more targeted and a little bit more intense. Last week in episode 3, Dr. Young and I talked about the components of reading fluency and then how to use Reader's Theater as an effective Tier 1 reading fluency support practice. And this week, we're going to shoehorn you right in the middle of our conversation. We're going to talk about Tier 2 and Tier 3 ideas of how to support learners in developing their fluency. It's a fantastic conversation. I got a lot out of it. I know you'll get a lot out of it as well. Stick around after the conversation and you'll be able to hear my 2 cents on what Dr. Young and I talked about. So without further ado, we're just going to plop you right into the middle of our conversation here. And thanks for listening. Moving on from Tier 1, if there may be students that don't respond to excellent Tier 1 fluency support. So then we're moving into Tier 2 where they might need more targeted support in a small group 2 to 3 times per week or more. Can you give us an idea of a Tier 2 fluency intervention that would work in small groups?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will warn you, as we move into the tiers, they're going to seem a little less engaging because they're going to be less fun. And they're going to be a little less authentic because Reader's Theater is kind of the approach we took to turn repeated readings into something authentic. Because why would you read anything over and over and over? Okay, because of a performance. But here at the fluency development lesson, and when we get into Tier 3, it's a little bit different. So the fluency development lesson is actually created by Tim Rasinski as well. And it is overall just helping kids read a text over and over and over in different ways. And so you can choose any text you want. I highly recommend picking some quality texts. Poetry's great. There's tons of good classical poetry or humorous poetry out there, like Poetry for Kids, I believe is Ken Nesbitt's site, and it has classics like cockroach sandwich for my lunch, hate the taste but love the crunch, and just whatever. So identify a text. It could be a short story, it could be nonfiction, and it's really what you think your kids would like. And in a small group, you read the text out loud to them while they follow along, and you can do that 2 or 3 times until you see them looking a little more comfortable, and then you start to you can do a choral reading of it. Where all of you read it together. And then you could do that 2 or 3 times. And then you could split them into partners and have partners read the same text 2 or 3 times to each other. And the partner that's listening can provide support and encouragement for the other one. And then the students take it home and read it to somebody. And I think that's important because, Tim Rasinski is famous for saying that he thinks that every kid should be able to read something successfully every day. not only for the instructional benefits, but also because of the confidence and motivation aspects of being able to take something home and read it to your family or dog or bowl of fruit, with it successfully, accurately, and as a good reader. And then after they take it home and they read it to somebody or themselves in the mirror, they can bring it back to school, and they can they read it to the teacher when they first come in, or they can read it to a friend, and then, or they could even, in groups, you could perform it for each other. But essentially, the fundamental and underlying research driving the fluency development lesson is the fact that they're practicing reading a lot.
And then you might have students that they still aren't responding well to a Tier 2 intervention, and they need more support beyond that. So we move into Tier 3, and like you said at the beginning, you recommend one-on-one in these simply because it's a fluency emergency, that these are students that they aren't going to progress out of that Tier 3 situation unless they receive some heavy, targeted, focused intervention. And that can be hard to carve out as a teacher, but it's worth it in the long run. So tell us about an intervention that you would recommend for a Tier 3 one-on-one intervention with students that have significant fluency struggles.
Yeah, you got it. I think I'll say something about this one-on-one thing as well. A lot of times we have volunteers, or we have paraprofessionals working in our classrooms. And Dick Allington's been saying this forever, because he's observed the most struggling readers getting put with somebody else. And in a lot of cases, that's frankly illegal. The certified teacher is the best trained and responsible for this. So what I recommend, if you can't do the one-on-one, before or after school in a tutoring situation, that you utilize your volunteers or your paraprofessionals with the rest of the class, and you work with that student one-on-one. You could even see this as like a guided reading group of its own. So you're calling groups, but then you call up, say, little Chase, who can't read so well, and it's his own group because he doesn't really fit anywhere else. So we have to be creative in ways. Now, we have conducted studies with Read to Impress, which is the intervention that I'm going to talk about, where we did train volunteers, the secretary, parents, everybody, because it was such an emergency in a particular district where students were struggling greatly with automaticity and fluency. So it is possible to have volunteers do this, and it's better than not doing it at all. So Read to Impress is an intervention that really you can't do with more than one kid, because it's highly calibrated, and it's kind of a combination of the neurological impress, which was R.G. Heckelman back in the 60s, used it a lot in resource rooms and students who were really, really struggling. So what you do is you choose a text that's about a year above the student's instructional level. And that's because we're going to provide such support and scaffolding through this process that they're often able to read the text. And because it's such an emergency, we pretty much have to drag them by the teeth and bring them where they need to be. Because if they're not where they need to be by third grade, the research says that the odds of them catching up are not very good. So Read to Impress starts with a text that's about a year above their level. And what you do is you sit down with the student and you begin with neurological impress method, which essentially is where you and the student begin reading out loud. And as soon as you kind of catch each other and you're reading out loud together, the teacher or tutor begins to read slightly ahead of the student, maybe like a syllable. So essentially, as soon as you're saying it, they're seeing it and also saying it. Now, the key here is to maintain that lead. So you're having to shift your pace to match the students, will just to stay above, because sometimes they slow down, sometimes they get a little bit faster, and you're also reading with really good expression, so they hear that. And the difference between read to impress and neurological impress is that we chunk the text. So we may do a paragraph with a student who's reading, a novel, or may do just a page with a picture book. Or you can do it with a poem, or again, the Wikipedia page of South Texas or whatever it is. But you read that chunk neurological impress style. So you're reading with good expression, staying right ahead of them. And then you stop and you have that student read it back to you. And what you hear is yourself. I believe Heckelman and back in the day referred to it as etching. So it kind of etches your reading expression in their brains, and that's going to help support comprehension as well, because we have that connection between the reading expression and reading comprehension. So, and then you move on to the next page or chunk of text, and you read it NIM style, neurological impress style, then you have them read it back to you, and then you keep going. When we first were messing with this, actually, it was with your chair.
It was with Kit, Dr. Moore, yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Moore. And she wanted to call it Chase Me, Show Me, because that was cute. And I was like, oh, yeah, we use my name. But what we ended up calling it was Reading Together. But then Reading Teacher, when we were first publishing it, we're like, oh, that's the name of something from the 70s. So we had to change it. So cleverly, we came up with Read to Impress. So we just keep doing that. And we do that for about 20 minutes a day. If it's a younger reader, kindergarten, first grade, maybe 10 minutes a day. And then you can move to, 20 to 30 with second and above, just depending on their stamina. But we've seen some really impressive things. When we first developed it or was messing with it, we took a third grader from a end of first grade level to on grade level, mid third grade, in about, I believe it was 12 weeks. Wow. Of this type of tutoring. And since then, we've done studies in several districts. And we've had statistically significant improvements in reading comprehension and overall reading achievement, as well as reading fluency. So, while these are fluency interventions, the real goal we have to keep in mind is building their fluency so it can serve as a foundation for reading comprehension.
And so it is pretty intensive, the 15 minutes a day, but, over the course of 12 weeks, if a student's able to make those types of gains, that's pretty impressive.
Right. And, we're not real sure if it's how we set it up or the fact that they're actually reading every day.
The volume factor.
It could be the volume. There's a few extraneous, variables that we can't really control for. I guess we could set up a study where we just had a kid read out loud every day for 15 minutes and then one group actually engage in this.
One of the studies you did with Read to Impress, didn't you measure reader attitudes as well?
We sure did. And our null hypothesis was not rejected. In other words, it did not have an effect on attitude at all. Now, we saw their ability to answer reading comprehension questions increase, their retell stood significantly increased, accuracy, fluency, expression, all of these things. But all the measures of attitude toward reading, recreational and academic, hardly moved at all. And we didn't really think that it would in the time frame that we had. We did a pre and post, and changing a reader's attitude that they view themselves as struggling readers. I only work with those that have difficulty. Nobody calls me when they're like, "Hey, everything's perfect. You should come out." So they've identified as a struggling reader for so long that I think it takes just as long of being a great reader for them to forget that they were ever, found it difficult. So I think if we had followed these kids along in a couple of years, maybe that attitude would have changed. And in fact, it's a crazy little story about one of the kids that was in the treatment group. I went back to this school where we did one of the studies, and I walked into a classroom, in a second grade classroom, but this kid was in first grade during the study. and because he was identified as struggling, at risk for reading failure. And I walked in and I was like, "Hey, what's up, buddy?" And I said his name. I'll go ahead and keep it private, I guess. And he was like, "Oh, Mr. Young," and came up and gave me a big hug. And I went and talked to his teacher, and I was like, she's like, "How do you know him?" I was like, "Oh, he was in the study last year." She goes, "Oh, no, he couldn't have been. He's my best reader." And I was like, no, well, and then so I conceded to her. I was like, "You know what? Maybe he was in the control group." And she's like, "Yeah, that's probably what it was." And I walked out of the classroom, and about 30 seconds later, she came running out of the classroom crying. And she was like, "He came up to me after you left, and he looked at me in the face, and he was kind of teary-eyed and said, 'I'll never forget that guy. He's the one who taught me how to read.'" And I was like, yeah. And then he came out to the hall, and we had like this little hug session, and it was crazy. So, we look at the stats, but behind the stats, there's a kid behind each one of those numbers, and we can't help them all with the interventions that we have available, but we can sure try.
Well, that's a great story. That I guess your career's done now. I mean, after that, that's exactly the high water.
I'm retired. Yep, absolutely.
So thanks for walking us through those 3 tiers. What recommendations would you give for a teacher who's sees the vision and wants to support their students better in their classroom with fluency?
Well, first of all, don't view fluency as a scary word or as a race. Think about ways where you can have students read a lot and read out loud and for various purposes. You can take a look at the book that has framed this. It's Tiered Fluency Instruction, Supporting Diverse Learners in Grades 2 through 5. They named it 2 through 5. It can be used with kindergarten and first as well as middle school. We use this with middle schoolers as well. In fact, the Neurological Impress was first tested with middle schoolers over a summer, and I think the average gain was like 2.6 years in reading achievement. So feel free to branch out from the 2 through 5. So I mean, just be thinking it. There's lots of great strategies out there. You can take the fundamentals of what we've been talking about today, of repeated readings, of challenging text, and you don't have to do reader's theater. You can switch it to anything. You could have students rehearse speeches. You could have students recite poetry, have poetry slams. Just any way that you can motivate students to repeatedly read in order to master a text is that I'm sure that would be a winner.
Thanks so much for a great discussion, Dr. Young. This has been fantastic. In your opinion, what makes a good teacher?
What makes a good teacher? Well, I'll start with a soft spot and be like, a good teacher is somebody who truly cares about their students and builds relationships with them. Without that, they don't really, you won't get as much from them as you could. So mutual respect is super important. Also, I think a teacher who's willing to take risks and apply research in their classrooms, those are great teachers. Sometimes we have conversations and they're like, "When do I do reader's theater?" I'm like, they're like, "I don't have any time in my schedule." And then, I'll ask them, be like, "Hey, do you do like morning work?" And they'll be like, "Yeah." Stop doing that. Really, all it is, so you can finish your coffee and they can come in and do something without bugging you. So get rid of stuff. Do curriculum audits constantly. Say, okay, I've been doing this for about 2 years now. Has it impacted my students? I don't know. Go ahead and test it out. And if it's not working, dump it. That's what makes a good teacher. A teacher who really is willing to take those risks because they truly care about those kids. I don't think there's one, adult out there that I taught in elementary school that calls me up and says, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much for helping me get an 86 on the state standardized test in 3rd grade." That's not what they remember at all. And that's not what impacted their education. So, build those relationships and teach your children well.
Thanks so much again for coming on the show. We've been the books we've been talking about is Tiered Fluency Instruction, Supporting Diverse Learners in Grades 2 through 5. And again, you said you can branch out from there. I found the book incredibly friendly to teachers, that it gives a nice solid base of the research, but also really is well organized to make it practical for teachers. You also mentioned thebestclass.org, which is your website that has the Reader's Theater scripts. And I believe there was a Facebook page for your doc students. Do you want to mention that, and maybe people can follow it if they're interested?
Yeah, sure. The docs, we have a literacy doctorate at Sam Houston State University, and our Facebook page is SHSU Literacy, and it's pretty cool. A lot of teachers follow it that aren't even in the program, because I post research articles twice a week and anything else that might be interesting that teachers may be able to read and possibly implement in their classrooms.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Chase Young, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been awesome.
Wasn't that a great conversation with Dr. Young? I really appreciate him taking the time to join us on the podcast. The title of his book was Tiered Fluency Instruction, Supporting Diverse Learners in Grades 2 through 5, and he just provided us a little snapshot of what's in the book. I highly recommend it. I had a great time reading it, and I had a lot of solid takeaways for my classroom. My 2 cents about our discussion is, the first thing is, I really enjoyed the approach he took with the RTI framework of us being able as teachers to provide multiple systems of support for our learners. So students are going to need different levels of support, and teachers, we need to do what we can to meet those needs. So like you said in the show, some students, 5 minutes of Reader's Theater a day is all the fluency support that they need. And if we can give them that fluency support in those 5 minutes, that's great. That frees up a whole lot of time for us to be focusing on comprehension and vocabulary and oral language and other crucial components that it takes to make great readers. Some students, though, are going to need more intensive and more targeted fluency support. And for those students, we need to give them that support so that they are more likely to be able comprehenders and being able to read smooth, connected text down the road, because that's an essential skill to being a good reader. And so if we as teachers can screen and then intervene to provide all of our students with the support they need with reading fluency, and across all areas of reading, of course, then that's when we're doing our job. So that was the first thing I really liked, was just, this was a great pragmatic way of looking at the RTI, of using the RTI framework in the classroom. Nothing abstract, it's just pragmatic. This is what it can look like. My second takeaway from what I talked to them about is the read to impress method. That was a method I was introduced by my mentor, Dr. Moore, who worked with Dr. Young on that research and publishing it. And it's one that I use in my classroom, and I keep using it because I like it. I like that it is able to help my struggling readers get into a connected text and to read that text over an extended period of time. And it also helps them access text that they would otherwise not be able to access. So if we're going, a grade or even 2 grades above their, independent reading level, as indicated by reading comprehension data, those are books that they likely would not be able to read or choose not to read on their own. But with an adult mentor that's able to read out loud with them at the same time, model that prosody, stay just a sliver, just a syllable ahead of their natural pace, that it really stretches those readers, but it also helps support their comprehension. So the read to impress method, I'm a fan of it. I think it's a great way to support the fluency and to a degree the comprehension of my most at-risk readers, and it's one that I've seen results from, and I've enjoyed using it. So thanks so much for joining us on this back-to-back episode with Dr. Young on tiered fluency instruction. Remember, the name of the book is Tiered Fluency Instruction, Supporting Diverse Learners in Grades 2 through 5, and you can get that on Amazon, or you can find it through your library. Next week, we'll be talking with Dr. Ray Reitzel about his book, Young Meaning Makers, Comprehension in Grades K through 2. That's a fantastic conversation. It's also a long one that we're going to break up into 2 parts, but it will be well worth it because there's a lot of great takeaways from there. So thanks for supporting the show. Feel free to subscribe. Feel free to give us a podcast review. Feel free, of course, to share it with a colleague of yours that you feel would benefit. And until next time, let's work on being just a little bit better at being great literacy teachers. Thanks for listening to our conversation today. Remember to check out the show notes for more details. If you have feedback or a show idea, feel free to email me at teachingliteracypodcast@gmail.com. This is Jake with the Teaching Literacy Podcast, and until next time, let's go and teach literacy just a little bit better.